Hi, my name is Matthew Robinson. I teach Protestant theology at the University of Bonn in the Protestant faculty. And I'm standing with Grace Davie, Professor Emeritus of the Sociology of Religion at Exeter University. We're standing together in Sarajevo at the conference of the European Society of Intercultural Theology and Interreligious Studies. Grace gave a fascinating lecture 2 days ago and has graciously offered to do this interview with us as we lead up to a symposium on the 24th and 25th of May in Bonn, being organized around the question, what does theology do, actually? This is a question that we're asking ourselves as theologians. We're wanting to invite not only internal but external perspectives on theology as a kind of social artifact, if you will. What does theology do? What functions does it have in and for the communities in which it arises and obtains meaning? There were 3 points in particular from Grace's lecture on Wednesday that I wanted to focus on, and so I've prepared these questions and we have a moment to discuss them together. Grace, in a lot of your work, you have focused on sort of a lived form of religion, and in the lecture on Wednesday, you encouraged us to put the book down and look out the window, and so we came outside here. But when you do that, that also requires that you identify a context, and that raises questions about who identifies a context, how that context is identified. And so my first question is just a practical research methods question. How you, as a sociologist of religion, go about with the phenomena and concept of context.
Well, I guess Sarajevo is not a bad place to start talking about context. It's very, very distinctive, and there would be a lot of history to have to take into account. Some of it very tragic. And then you would have to think in a place like Sarajevo, which has been a member of 6 countries, I think, in the last 100 years, 6 different political entities, and has experienced First War, very pivotal in the beginning of the First War, Second War, and then a very recent war. And we've heard a lot about that in this conference. A lot of our thinking has been governed by that history, and we're now emerging from that. So that's one point. You would have to think how the place where you are came to be as it is, what came before. But you mustn't be stuck in the past, because you've got to go forwards. Now, if I was thinking about your question about what does theology do, actually, I guess the way I would relate to that kind of idea, because I'm a social scientist, not a theologian, was to respect very much the thinking and reflections of theologians and their real searching for the right kind of thinking to answer their profound and demanding questions. And I respect that entirely. But I would always be asking too, why did that individual think in that way? Had it got to do something with where they lived, who they were they a man, were they a woman, were they in a community? And if those ideas became current and sparked off a discussion, how would they be carried forward? By what individuals or by what communities? Why do some people agree and some people not? All the, as it were, contextual factors that you would have to take into account to have a full understanding of why and how that theology developed, which is not to discount in any way the quality of the thinking or the independence of mind. I'm not advocating a determinist position, but I do think it's a reciprocal situation between the kind of thinking, ideas, philosophical views, theological views that emerge in particular situations, and the embeddedness of the people who are carrying them forward and the communities of which they're parts.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense, and yet it remains a real challenge for us in theology to, if you will, step outside of ourselves and see that we are in a context, and the claims that we take to be general are very much products of our particular situation.
Probably contextual. I guess the point that follows on from that is that contexts change.
Right.
Um,
Right.
You can see the context has changed here. In the last 20 years, thanks be to God, it's more peaceful.
Yeah.
But you can still see the residue and the tensions of the earlier period.
Yeah.
Now, how does theological thinking deal with that? And let's step aside and take a very different question. We think very differently about gender and same-sex relationships. That's been part of our thinking in the conference. Now, how do not only theological currents, but also church groups, some of which may have very strong views on family life and the roles of men and women, how do they adapt? Do they dig their heels in and say, what we have thought for this length of time just continues, we don't change? Or do we begin to learn from that situation and think, well, maybe we should adapt or develop, or and then how do we do that? And we were talking over lunch a little bit earlier, and I suggested that this kind of question is a very deep question about what does it mean to be human. Gender relationships are part of humanity, of how we relate to each other. And the example I used was, do we still think ever that left-handed people were sinister?
Yeah.
Are sinister? Well, clearly there was an elision, because that's how the word is. The word sinister means left in Latin, but it has huge connotations in English of darkness and negativity, as does gauche in French, which means left as well, and it means clumsy. Clearly we see that was wrong and incorrect. Now, are we, say, in another decade or perhaps generation, going to be very different in our reflections about same-sex? That it's not something odd or sinister. It's just a difference to be embraced.
And as those contexts are changing and sort of cultural self-understandings are changing, you asked, how are the theologies also changing? And that's kind of what we're talking about. What are the theologies doing for people and communities as they react?
That's your job, not mine. I'm simply talking about the context. Now, if you're going to engage theologically with those changes, and you can see that it's not easy, because you can see that theological currents and churches that embrace different theologies come to very different conclusions. We had an input that I much appreciated from a Franciscan here, who was very aware of the tensions within the Catholic Church, within the Catholic Church, never mind beyond it. Some of his colleagues, Franciscan colleagues, were clearly embracing change, and others were not. How do you read Scripture in a different context? How do women read Scripture? How do minority groups read Scripture? We're talking now about queer theologies as well as feminist theologies and gendered theologies and theologies of minorities and ethnic groups. So is theology one thing or several? How all these people are clear that they're searching for a way of thinking that they find satisfying, that they claim some sort of truth-making or truth claims in it, but it can't be done in a vacuum.
Right.
It never can.
Right.
And so it's bound to evolve. At least that's what I think. But I don't want to do it for theologians. I simply reflect on this relationship between context and ideas. It's complex, it's challenging, but so interesting.
And at every point, lived. And everything you were just saying there.
Absolutely.
Theology is no less lived than any of our other religious performances.
Exactly.
Practices.
Exactly. And the point you made at the beginning, you start with the text. I mean, textual work is crucially important to the theologian. I admire textual scholars. I admire the linguistic scholars, those who know ancient languages and really help us to understand the text. I mean, we need those scholars. But remember, the people who wrote in those ancient languages lived in contexts. Why did they write in that language? Those languages didn't just happen. The biblical texts came through linguistic development for reasons.
And something I often was told as a student studying these languages was to try to pay attention to the ways the languages sort of reflect cultural understandings, cultural trends, and so on. We're at the meetings of the Society for Intercultural Theology, and this also very closely related to questions of context raises questions of culture. And I'm curious, as a social scientist and as a sociologist of religion, how do you reflect on the concept of culture? Obviously, you don't see it as static, and I'm guessing you don't have any kind of essentialist view of culture.
No.
So, as a social scientist, what would you say we're doing when we do intercultural theology?
Well, I think you're asking me the same question twice in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
You're asking me to reflect culturally on. If you're building a context, you can think, for example, about relationships between men and women, and families, and power, and political systems, and who has rights, who doesn't have rights, and law, and that kind of thing. But you can also think in terms of culture, as to what is sustained in terms of the ways you think and the patterns of living. I mean, in my lecture the other day was talking about the rhythms of time, and we often in Europe we take for granted the fact that weeks and weekends are
right.
I mean, we all understand that on Saturday you say, "Oh, good, thank goodness it's Saturday," and on Sunday, some people still go to church, but many people don't. But it is a different day, even if it's a day of diverse activities rather than work.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a day of rest. But that pattern comes from the Christian tradition. And that's why migrants who come into Europe, particularly into West Europe, sometimes think, well, if I want to celebrate my holy day, I am at odds with the dominant culture. If I want to celebrate a festival, now in Britain, which is relatively accepting, not perfectly, but relatively, you're not often denied a day off work if you wanted to you say it's a Hindu festival or whatever, but you'll take it as a day of holiday or leave, and you'll leave. It won't be part of the mainstream. And so, and if you're an Orthodox Jew, you will have a problem working in some situations if you can't stop working early on a Friday. And it's those rhythms that you take for granted. That's culture. That's culture. And then suddenly something happens, and you're brought up short, and you think, gosh, that isn't just, that's happened because of a reason. I mean, I do that talking with students, you know. And if you think through the year in Europe, I mean, we have our big festivals of Christmas and Easter. Now, most of my students could tell you what Christmas and Easter was. I'd have to push a bit, and some. They wouldn't know what Pentecost was. And, you know, so some of those original reasons are now fading. But the basic rhythm is there, and it's interestingly challenged by diversity.
One of the things, or another thing that's come up a lot in terms of challenges, have been things like religion and gender at the conference, religion and violence, and then today especially religion and trauma. The trauma that follows from the ways that gender and violence come under the spotlight, under attack. And so out of this, I mean, these are very, yes, we can look at them social scientifically, but they're also very practical, ethical. And on Wednesday, one of your concluding points was to say how important it is to develop well-judged partnerships between science and other levels of society, whether that's political, policy level, or civic, in terms of working with volunteer organizations and so on. How do you make those judgments well?
Well, let's start with what we're talking about, which is a kind of complementarity, I would say, between social scientific thinking and theology or philosophy. They're different kinds of knowledge. Now, sociology, in its development in Europe, did rather construct theology as benighted and the other. And sociology was going to bring enlightenment. It developed out of the French Enlightenment. And so you really got a rather negative displacing. And that's still part of the DNA of sociology. That's hard to get rid of. There's still quite a negative attitude towards religion in the modern world. It's either dismissed as being likely to disappear because of secularization, or where that is manifestly not happening, there's a resentment that religion is back. Now, a lot of what I said that day, maybe the best thing is to point your colleagues and students to the references that will be on that PowerPoint, and you can begin to read about the project out of which these ideas came.
Yes.
The International Panel on Social Progress, and how we set up the chapter on religion in that context.
We will definitely do that.
I think that would be a good idea.
Yeah.
But we can now get a much more much greater complementarity between your kind of thinking and mine, if I may put it that way. You know, how I work on context and people and memory and the organizations and churches and other organizations that carry these ideas, and you are working on the way these ideas become coherent systems and build together, and how they evolve and change over time, and how they're disputed, and how different people think different things, and that kind of thing. I don't think there's any necessary incompatibility. Now, if we were to take a more practical example, now let's think of development studies. And if you were working in sub-Saharan Africa and you were responsible for medical care, delivery of healthcare, you wouldn't get far if you relied simply on state organisation, secular welfare developments. They've both been big players. States are sometimes rather diminished or sometimes corrupt in many parts of the world. Secular welfare has its own codes and limitations, but the most extant network in much of that part of Africa, that part of the world, will be a religious network, or many different religious networks. Now, again, in the International Panel on Social Progress, in our chapter, we found a great study which we cited, published in The Lancet, which is a major medical journal in Britain, who were looking at the situation saying, we really do ask you to work together, to think very carefully about partnerships, not naively, don't shack up with everyone. Decide together, sit down together and work out all the things that you can do together. And what the churches will often offer is contact, network, penetration. Now, you may come to a point, say, on reproductive health, where a Catholic development organisation will not quite do what the secular development people would like. Well, there you part company, but not until then. You don't start from the beginning saying we could not possibly work with you because the end point is different. You can do 75-80% of stuff in partnership. And then you perhaps have to graciously say to each other, now we do our thing different, something different. That's fine. We respect you, you respect us. And the other example I gave, which is different, but I think it's very striking, is when the first Ebola epidemic in West Africa came to an end, it was quite clear that an absolutely critical set of decisions came around burial practice. Because the contamination, the extreme contagion of that disease was being passed on by contact with a dead body. Observing traditional Muslim burial practice. Now, the imams, local imams, who had sufficient authority to challenge, or not to challenge it, but to say, for the time being, we will do it differently. Which allowed the community to respond. And now, nobody else could have done that. It had to be the religious authority. And they said, until this is over, we simply put the body in the ground. We respect the individual. It's very dignified, but we do not touch it. So the traditional washing, touching was just suspended. And the authority came from religious people. But it was embraced, of course, and endorsed by secular people and medical people, because that was the right thing to do. Now, there's a really good example of well-chosen partnership.
And of life-giving theological work, if you will.
That theology, ritual, could be adapted
Yep.
under duress
Mm-hmm.
for good reasons.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the question of religion and violence, which we've thought a lot about this weekend or this 2-3 days. My social scientific question is not, does religion cause violence?
Mm-hmm.
It's under what circumstances is it likely that religion will become involved in this or that conflict?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a social scientific question that is answered by observation, by careful interpretation of the data, and it's not answered by theology.
Yeah.
It's answered by looking at circumstance and circumstantial evidence and saying, if this or that or the other is in place, you ought to watch out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay? Because the wrong kinds of theology,
Mm-hmm.
if you like, or distorted theology could play havoc in this if you let it.
That brings us right back around to questions of context.
Exactly.
Context sensitivity, awareness,
Yes.
and being out in the communities, doing that theological, but also development, but also social scientific work
Yeah, but without
at the same
that
time.
negating or diminishing the theological task.
Right. Exactly.
It's enabling.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for such a rich conversation. We have already talked for a very long time elsewhere, and we could continue talking a long time now. But I think this will give us a lot to think about and some nice stimulus for the symposium that's coming up. So thank you once again.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you very much. Good
And I
luck
hope
with your
that we
work.
can stay in conversation as well.
Me too. That's a phrase I shouldn't use, isn't it? But I do say me too. I wish you very, very well, and I hope very much that we stay in contact. And I'm
Thank you.
delighted that my colleague
Yes.
Esther will be with you.
Yes. Well, it's an honor to be able to speak with you. If you have not yet and you are interested, please send an email to this email address and register for the symposium coming up on the 24th and 25th of May in Bonn. Registration is free, but spots are a little bit limited. And we look forward to seeing you, getting to know you, and doing some theological work together.